Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us. My name is Chris Hahn, and I'm the co-director for research and education over at the North Carolina Environmental Justice Network. And I'm very happy to be having and moderating this session on the environmental justice, industrial animal agriculture, and rural communities. This is an important issue that we work with in our and I'm happy to have several of our partners here today to discuss how communities are impacted by industrialized animal agriculture and confined animal feeding operations. That ends up being a really important source of pollution here in the South and across the country, but really one that we don't talk about as much because it doesn't come from a smokestack. But people and the environment are often bear the brunt of this type of pollution. And so I'm very happy to have these experts to be able to dive in on this issue some more. So I'm going to go ahead and ask our panelists to introduce themselves. Let's start with Dr. Courtney Woods.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Courtney Woods. I'm a faculty member at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill in the Environmental Sciences and Engineering Department, which is in the School of Public Health. I also direct the Environmental Justice Action Research Clinic and also serve as lead for 2 MPH concentrations within the School of Public Health. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for being here. Sherry?
Thanks, Chris. Hi, everyone. I'm glad to be here today. My name is Sherry White Williamson. I am the Director of Environmental Justice Strategy at the North Carolina Conservation Network, where my role is to look more deeply across North Carolina to try and work on many of these issues, incorporating many of our partners, particularly our rural and less urban and suburban partners in this work. I also am co-founder of the Environmental Justice Community Action Network, which is a nonprofit in Sampson County, North Carolina, which is the second largest hog producing county in the United States. So have a lot of close experience with the problems associated with this. And finally, I teach an environmental justice, graduate level environmental justice course at Duke University at the Nicholas School of the Environment. It's a pleasure being here. Thanks.
Thank you, Sherry. And Tyler?
Yeah, thank you, Chris. My name is Tyler Lobdell. I'm a staff attorney with Food and Water Watch. We're a nationwide nonprofit that focuses on climate and energy, water rights, and then food system reform. And so my work is focused on industrial animal agriculture and the pollution impacts from that industry. My focus is primarily on water pollution. But as we'll talk about today, this industry kind of pollutes all aspects of our environment. And yeah, really honored to be on this panel today. So thank you so much for having me.
Thank you all. So I'll start off with our first question. And what are some of the environmental health concerns that you have seen related to concentrated animal feeding operations, or CAFOs?
I don't mind jumping in and answering that one. So this is based on the literature and a lot of the work that I've observed that came out of Dr. Steve Wang's group, the late Steve Wang at UNC, in looking at both workers that work in hog operations in North Carolina. So there are lots of different CAFOs, and a lot of the work that's happening in North Carolina is focused on hog and poultry CAFOs. And so there's been evidence to demonstrate that workers in those facilities experience higher levels of chronic bronchitis and asthma. There were studies as well as carriage of bacteria that are specific to hog operations, so nasal carriage of that bacteria. There have been studies to demonstrate that children in schools close to hog operations experience higher rates of asthma than children at schools that are not as close to those facilities. There's been evidence of irritation of eyes and nose, some impacts on mental health and mood. And then I think one of the biggest health concerns, because of the practice of sort of persistent delivery of antibiotics to hogs, is the potential spread of antimicrobial resistant bacteria. And so that's a sort of global concern. But that potential is certainly great in these regions where poultry and hogs are fed those antibiotics, because they're housed in such close quarters, and they use that both as a way to prevent infectious disease, but also as a way for increasing this, my knowledge, increasing the size of some of those animals.
In addition to what Courtney just said, I think that we also have to look at the sociological and psychological impacts on these communities. We oftentimes don't think about the fact that just the constant noise or of the pigs or of the hogs, trucks coming back and forth can lead to certain other additional stressors within the community. Dr. Steve Wing's work showed that there was increased levels of depression and high blood pressure, and some of the things that you don't necessarily think about, but are definitely associated with living in a community that's constantly bombarded by CAFO operations. And when you think of CAFO operations, it's not just swine or poultry. It tends to be a combination of many different types of operations that are closely located in one community, which creates a lot of cumulative impacts that I'm sure we'll get a chance to talk about a little bit later.
Yeah, and if, I'll just kind of follow on the last point that Sherry made, and that's the cumulative impacts point. The way this industry has decided to structure itself to reduce cost is to put as many animals in as small a region as possible, so they can cut down on processing costs and feed transport and things like that. And what that leads to are these regions throughout the country where you have this sort of plethora of pollution problems that come along with the industry deciding to concentrate itself the way it does. And so some of those pervasive environmental impacts are things like reduced air quality, but also groundwater contamination. And so unfortunately, this industry also tends to site itself in rural areas where a lot of residents tend to rely on groundwater or groundwater wells for their primary source of drinking water. And what we see is especially nitrate contamination of drinking water in a lot of places throughout the country. And nitrate has a whole host of human health impacts that can be caused from chronic exposure or acute exposure. But it's one of these unfortunate byproducts of this factory farm industry, where you have so much waste being generated by so many animals, and then that gets disposed of locally. The local landscape just can't accommodate that level of waste disposal practice, land use in terms of waste disposal. And so you end up with essentially these hotspots where people are exposed to these unsafe levels of contaminated drinking water because the industry has structured itself the way it is. And so again, that's nitrate pollution, but that's also things like harmful algal blooms or phosphorus-driven eutrophication of waterways. So fish kills, these algal blooms that are unsafe for wildlife, pets, or humans to come in contact with. So, this sort of bandwagon of pollution impacts, again, comes along wherever we see this industry really take up shop and dominate a region.
Thank y'all for those answers. And I want to give some time for Phoebe to also introduce herself. Phoebe, good to see you.
Thank you. And as you can tell, I'm joining by phone in the car. And sorry, it took me a second to figure out how to join a new kind of virtual meeting place. Phoebe Seaton, I'm with a community-based advocacy organization called Leadership Council for Justice and Accountability. We're based in two major agricultural regions in California, but for the purposes of this work, it's really focused in the San Joaquin Valley. where the majority of the issues that we're dealing with, there is poultry and cattle, but what we work primarily on is dairy cows and concentrated dairy cow operations, and the relationship between dairies and biogas. And just one other thing that I wanted to kind of add to the pile of cumulative impacts and psychological impacts is a lot of the folks that we work with, when they raise issues around living near large kind of factory farms and the impacts of those factory farms, the response is always, well, like, you didn't have to live here, live somewhere else, which also has like really negative impacts kind of on the individual and the community health. But I think we're just doing intro, so I will stop there.
Well, no, that's a great segue into my next question, because what you hit on is the location of the farms themselves, and which tend to be disproportionately sited in communities of color, low income areas, and neighborhoods with limited power overall. So if y'all could actually share lessons learned and best practices that attendees could use to fight against these unhealthy agricultural practices in their community, that'd be wonderful.
I think that zoning is a huge issue if you can work with local elected officials to change zoning policies to prevent that kind of thing from happening. Here in North Carolina, one of the other issues with the super concentration is the permitting process, such that there cannot be any consideration given to the proliferation of other operations within that same area. So there is no real prohibition on the placement. So there needs to be some regulatory changes, probably some type of legislative changes, in order to make a difference in these communities. Because once these facilities are here, as Phoebe said, folks can't just pack up and leave. We hear all the time folks talking about how their property values have gone down. No one is going to buy property in those areas where they know that the property value is already very low. However, the tax base doesn't go down for those same folks. So they're expected to pay property taxes at a level that the home was originally valued at, even though the value may have gone down 25, 30, even 50% in many cases. And there's no option to move because they would be selling at a loss and not be able to afford to buy something else. So they're kind of stuck in a dead zone, in a manner of speaking, without any options to get away. And the industry has such control that they're able to almost have the final say on what happens in those communities and whether something else gets placed there or not. But once they're there, it's difficult to have them removed, if at all. And I guess I should say, I don't know that there are any best practices for communities to fight against this, except for trying to get zoning changes or legislative changes that would prevent the continued concentration of those facilities in those areas.
I'll add a little to what Sherry has mentioned, and note that I think there are a lot of states that have developed hazard mapping tools to identify communities that are disproportionately impacted or have cumulative risks. And not many of those states are using the maps to implement new laws around cumulative impacts. But I think one best practice, assuming that a state is going to use that to identify communities that are disproportionately impacted, is to make sure that those tools are identifying rural communities and not sort of focusing on areas of high population density. Just because there aren't a lot of people in rural communities doesn't mean that those the facilities that are there, in this case, hog operations or poultry operations, doesn't mean that they're not having a pretty severe impact on the folks who live around them. So I think that might be one other best practice to ensure that tools that might be used to identify who's most impacted, to make sure that they're not slated or not designed against sort of rural communities.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. And I'll just put in like specifically, that means that perhaps using something like census tract or census block actually may not make sense in a rural context, or it may not show the actual diversity or population that's there at that granular level, or the scale in which the environmental injustice is actually occurring, because rural spaces are by definition very few people over a large land area. So it can still mean that people are actually experiencing a lot more cumulative impacts that y'all have suggested, but maybe not showing up on a map that is basically diluting that, spreading that across a much larger area.
That's a great point.
And I would just add, I mean, I'm sure Sherry and Phoebe and maybe Courtney as well have a lot more hands-on experience with this than I do, but organizing is so important because, you know, this industry hopes to put itself in places where they're not going to be confronted with organized resistance to their plans. And so they look for areas that are rural. They look for areas where they expect folks won't feel that they have political power. And so it's just that foundational reality that organizing your neighbors, organizing those that are going to be most impacted by a potential new factory farm or expanded factory farm or biogas addition to a factory farm, is such a critical, just foundational piece of work that needs to happen, because for the most part, folks people don't want their wells to be contaminated. They don't want to have toxic plumes of dust rising above their home every evening because there's a new factory farm next door. But at the same time, there can be a lot of resistance to speaking out against agriculture in a lot of communities. And so just building those relationships goes such a long way for what can often be, you know, pretty long fights to protect your community. So.
Thank you. So I'll go on to my next question. CAFOs, we talked about some of their hazards in terms of water. Also, the movement of waste in general is an issue. But they also emit nitrogen and ammonia, which can cause those adverse health consequences as well, impacting, not just the immediate area, but also adjacent communities. Let's see, specifically out in I think in California, Somerset County, approved a new rule that doubles the minimum space between chicken houses and a residence from 200 feet to 400 feet due to complaints of local community members. Are you aware of this specific practice, or of increasing that buffer? And do you think that practice will address the challenge?
I don't know if anybody wants to speak to that. I don't know. That Somerset is not, that's not California. So I don't know if somebody don't a couple kind of things from our end is from the air quality perspective, like in terms of that seems like not quite rearranging chairs on the Titanic, but the kind of the amount of, like you said, you know, nitrogen, NOx, ammonia going into the air in the region in these kind of concentrated basins is one thing. And then another issue, which I don't know any of us brought up, and maybe before I learned how to get into the room, was odor. And so that doesn't, I mean, what we're seeing, what we hear with odor is that the proximity is one issue, but it's also this, like, just prevailing winds, who's downwind, who's not downwind. And one thing that we just learned that, again, just kind of piles on to what everybody's saying, is that we're working on a one dairy expansion right now. And the owner of a property can sort of waive the right to be a certain distance. But what we're concerned about is that if there's farm labor housing, the owner is either the farm operator or very connected to the farm operator and going to happily waive any kind of distance requirements. Which doesn't directly answer your question, but in terms of on the dairy side, with a 5,000, 7,000, 10,000 cow dairy, in a couple 100 feet is probably not going to be life changing.
Chris, the emission of nitrogen and ammonia also comes into play with what's happening in a lot of places now with the installation of anaerobic digesters. And we know with the installation of anaerobic digesters and from the research that's already been done, that you can anticipate an increase in the level of nitrogen and ammonia that would be present. In North Carolina, for example, if a farm decides to install a digester and does not have a lagoon current, and when I refer to a lagoon, I'm basically referring to a multiple pool size cesspool containing the waste from the hogs in that operation. If they do not have a lagoon that is already lined, that they would be allowed to dig another lagoon and line it to accept the waste from the digester process. And that could even be closer to the property line of an adjoining neighbor. So rather than making it safer and farther away, potentially the adjoining property owner could be exposed to much, much more than they would, because they will be in closer proximity to a new process as well as what's already existing. So ammonia and nitrogen are definitely a problem, and it's not just in the air. We are doing water testing here on a voluntary basis, and are finding the presence of nitrates in the water that we're testing in alarming levels in some cases. So this is a problem that unfortunately will continue unless there are policies that are put in place to reduce these types of exposures.
And Sherry, while you mentioned biogas in general, that I want to spend a little bit of time on that, because that is something that is a renewable energy source in terms of taking a waste product from this facility and then reusing it for energy. And so it is very much in line with getting off of fossil fuels and being able to do more cleaner energy for our grid and things like that. While biogas seems like a good idea for those reasons, what concerns do folks have about using biogas and in this context with CAFOs, what concerns do you have?
Well, biogas, or at least the PR around biogas and it being a renewable energy source, has been fantastic. The truth is that the only way it's a renewable energy source is if you grow more hogs. And the fact is that you have to put the lagoon, the digester system in order to create enough methane to justify the whole biogas system to start with. It's more harmful to the community. As I said earlier, just putting in that digester means there's going to be an increase in some of those most harmful gases within that community. While allowing the system to continue as a lagoon and spray field system, and the industry being able to justify these antiquated practices, rather than moving away from those antiquated practices and using some of the technology that is better, the best available technology, rather than using the PR of renewable natural gas as an excuse to keep the antiquated system in place that exists, rather, and not investing the kind of money into those systems that they can. These industries are multi-billion-dollar businesses, but they continue to use the excuse that to use the right kind of technology is not economically feasible for them. So basically, they choose money over people, and we've got to try to get away from that, and we've got to continue to tell this story.
Thank you, Sherry. Anyone else on that?
Sure, I'm happy to jump in. I think it's really important to distinguish between renewable and clean energy, because I think it's easy to conflate those two. And as Sherry said, sure, I guess we're talking about a renewable source of energy in that we could just continue to raise more hogs or more cows on factory farms. That's very different than, is this a clean energy? Is this the kind of energy that as a society we're moving toward? And it's not, it's really the opposite of clean. I'm sort of repeating what Sherry has already said a little bit here, but in order to have biogas production at an industrial animal ag facility, you need to have really environmentally harmful systems in place to facilitate that biogas production. So you need these lagoons or these cesspools. And along with that comes the spray field method of disposal. So once a facility is liquefying their waste and then spraying it on fields, you have a whole host of public health and environmental problems that are baked into that system. You can only produce biogas if you're liquefying your waste and putting it in these cesspools. And so to have biogas production, you have to have this devastating underlying system already in place. And so the biogas, the monetization of that both rewards that decision to pollute your community, and it incentivizes more of it. It incentivizes more animals in facilities like that, and it incentivizes manure management practices that facilitate more profit from biogas. So that means managing the waste in the least responsible ways so that you can make money off this new revenue stream. And I'll also note that this is not a climate solution. This also entrenches natural gas infrastructure and pipelines and continued reliance on natural gas burning in industry and in residential construction. And so that also, any rational policymaker accepts that we need to move away from natural gas as part of our, transition to an equitable and safe climate future. This moves us in the opposite direction. I unfortunately work on this biogas issue around the country, and what we see is an expansion of the natural gas utilities capital investments along with these biogas production facilities going in at factory farms. So it really is both the industrial animal ag industry that uses it to greenwash their operation and entrench their most dangerous practices. And then we have the fossil fuel side of it, which again uses this product to greenwash its operations. A really stark example of this is a company that went into partnership with Smithfield Foods, the largest pork producer in the world. Their marketing pitch is, if we can just get 4% of our natural gas from Smithfield factory farms, we're climate neutral or we're climate negative. So we're going to have 96% fracked fossil gas, 4% factory farm gas from Smithfield factory farms. And this company is now going to say that it is good for not only not a climate problem, it's good for the climate. And so it really is a boondoggle from all angles.
Thank you both for breaking that down. Dr. Woods, do you have anything else in terms of biogas that hasn't been said?
I feel like Sherry and Tyler touched on it pretty well. I was going to try to maybe connect this to the previous question and just note the real harm of maintaining the spray field, lagoon and spray field system. So, no amount of moving residents twice as far from the facility will get rid of the potential for the aerosolized liquid fecal waste from, really being able to travel. It can travel miles depending on what the atmospheric conditions are, and the potential for that to enter into surface waters and groundwater. So I think just connecting this idea of, trying to produce a natural energy source requires this system to be in place. And, even if you're trying to improve the system by getting people farther away from these facilities, increasing the distance between the facilities, that system in and of itself is harmful to the environment and to humans that might be exposed.
Thanks for that. And I see a question from the audience, like, given everything that's being said, would it be better or feasible to aerobically digest the manure? And so I'll add in to that question just that is this issue a technical one or an issue of power? So, and I'll say, like, are there other options other than biogas and other waste processes that would be better for the environment? And if so, why haven't they been implemented? Why is biogas being something that's widely accepted?
Go ahead, Sherry, please.
No, I was going to give a short answer. Actually, the waste is being aerobically digested now. The reason that the process is going to anaerobic digesters is to try and make a little bit more money off of the process. Currently, the waste is captured in a lagoon, which, as I said, can be the size of several football fields. And that waste is allowed to evaporate aerobically for a while, and then it is sprayed on adjoining fields. What the anaerobic process does is capture more of the methane rather than let it do as it's doing now, being aerobically evaporated into the air. So that system is one that already exists, and that doesn't work either, because you are talking about the average farm may have anywhere from 4,000 to 9,000 animals. Each animal excretes about 11 pounds of waste a day. That waste is cleaned out of that farming system into the lagoon, and then that waste is sprayed on the fields. So you're already creating a problem. And so anaerobic digestion doesn't really solve the problem, because, as Tyler alluded to, you end up with that waste seeping into the groundwater, into adjoining streams, fish kills, fungi, all kinds of things going on. So it's very harmful either way. There are some other systems, but again, as I said, the industry has said none of those are economically feasible for them to be used. And Tyler, I'll turn it over to you, because I'm sure you've dealt with this a lot as well.
Sure. Thanks, Sherry. You phrased your question in a really interesting way, and so I'm going to try to directly answer it. I really do think this is a power issue more than it is a technical issue. This industry has structured itself in such a way that it cannot operate without degrading the local environment and negatively impacting communities nearby. And so whether its waste goes through a digester or not, it's still an unsustainable framework. And as Sherry has explained, the digestion process doesn't solve that in any way. If anything, it makes that problem more acute because of how it changes the waste stream itself. But that waste still gets land applied. And so that problem remains whether or not you have this aerobic versus anaerobic decomposition. And I'll just quickly explain what we're talking about there, because we haven't really given that background, because it's a really good question. Methane emissions, which is the main greenhouse gas that we're talking about when we're talking about anaerobic digesters, methane emissions from these types of facilities, from factory farms, is a major problem. And that's because of how they manage their waste, and because they put their waste into anaerobic environments, or environments without oxygen, to help the organics break down the way they naturally do in the environment. That same waste could also be breaking down aerobically, or in the presence of oxygen. So, for example, a pig on pasture or a cow on pasture is going to be defecating onto the pasture. It's going to break down in the presence of air, and it's going to become part of the soil in the sort of natural cycle that we all probably learned about early in school, this cycle that's been happening for millennia. That relationship is completely thrown out the window with the factory farm model. There's no longer a relationship between the animals and the landscape because the animals are confined and their waste accumulates on these confined facilities. And so just want to highlight that methane emissions from animal manure is not an intrinsic problem. It's a problem because of how this industry has structured itself. And so aerobically managing that waste certainly does not solve the problem. What it does do is it eliminates this methane emission issue that the industry is now focusing on and saying they're good actors because they're capturing their methane with anaerobic digesters. But that misses the point that the methane didn't need to be generated in the first place if the facility didn't have so many animals such that it couldn't responsibly manage the waste it generates, if it wasn't liquefying its waste in such huge quantities that it creates these certain environments that generates methane. And so is it feasible to be managing waste better? Yes. But as a foundational point, you cannot raise tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of animals in a particular watershed or airshed and not anticipate and expect that to have pretty serious environmental and public health consequences, whether or not you have a digester, right? It's just, that is a fundamental flaw in the system, or it's how the system's designed, but it is a flaw from a public well-being perspective.
And while we're talking about methane, Chris, the Clean Air Act, methane is not a criteria pollutant under the Clean Air Act. So there aren't any limits per se that we could even go to the EPA, for example, and say, this area has this exceedance of methane and we'd like for you to do something about it. So there actually are some efforts at this point to try and encourage EPA to add methane as a criteria pollutant. But at this point, it isn't even a criteria pollutant under the Clean Air Act. And so you have a major problem with all of these factory farms producing all of this methane without any controls under the Clean Air Act, basically.
So I want to go back, since we've been touching on just the fundamental structures of how CAFOs are designed and how that is an issue. That also means that what you've mentioned before, the clustering and growth of CAFOs, so that they are densely populated, not just with animals in a single facility, but several facilities will be in a county, in an area. And they also are expanding their footprint within those areas. So that's led to those growing water quality issues and others in several environmental justice communities. What can be done to address that specifically? And how can we strike a balance between keeping independent farmers viable and preserving our natural resources? But in there's also the question of, like, who actually are the farmers that are doing CAFOs? Are they independent? You could touch on that too if you wanted.
I'll jump in quickly. We're seeing a lot of this, especially in some areas. The balance of power is so tilted towards the farms and the farmers and agribusiness, and away from natural resources, and especially community members impacted. That so in some places in California, the expansions are subject to environmental review, and in some cases, the kind of the power of the industry and the rhetoric, and I think Sherry spoke to the PR of the industry, is so powerful that there isn't even environmental review, because there's just a kind of an assumption that, like, quote unquote family farmers are good for the economy, good for the environment, good for the world. So there isn't even the discussion of the weighing the costs and benefits of the expansion of the farm and the the impact on the environment. Then there's also, everybody's a family farmer in California, and that might be true throughout the country as well. So you have these, multi-billion-dollar operations, but there is at some point like a family at the center of it. So there's, again, like that adds to the rhetoric of the, you know, the agrarian mystique and the poor family farmer that we need to support. So I mean, we would call for, you know, one thing that I didn't touch on, and you touched on, I think, Chris, in terms of the concentration near communities of color, is there's also the issue of, in California, we have a pretty robust civil rights framework. So we have been trying to call into question the disproportionate impact on communities of color and using kind of fair housing laws and fair housing rhetoric. So we would just definitely argue that there needs to be so much work to rebalance the conversation towards communities and away from just the assumption that family farmers are good for everybody.
Yeah, and I mean, the rhetoric around family farmers is really pretty extreme, and so the way that, and this is different for this manifests a little bit differently for the dairy industry versus the poultry industry versus the swine industry, but taking swine and poultry, I think are close-ish enough to talk about them together. The folks who are producing or raising animals for Tyson Foods, for example, or Smithfield Foods, are making very few choices of their own. They are operating under contracts with those integrators that more or less dictates almost every single aspect of how their operation runs. So they're told what animals they're going to house. They're told what size the barn has to be. They're told how high the food troughs have to be at any given point in the production cycle. They're given the food by the integrator. They're provided medicine or not by the integrator. And the cold date or the time in which the animals will stay at the farmers' facilities is dictated by the integrator. So I've heard a poultry grower, for example, describe his life as a poultry grower as a dead chicken janitor. He did not feel that he was a farmer. He felt that he was a janitor for his integrator and merely had all of the liability on his shoulders, whereas all the profits go to the integrator. So even this relationship about who are we saving, what interests, because for Food and Water Watch, we're extremely concerned about family farmers. And our vision, our positive vision, is a more regionalized, smaller scale system of agriculture where families are at the center of production the way they used to be, not corporate power at the center of the dynamic. But I think identifying what you mean by family farmer is extremely critical in that conversation, because again, the pork industry will say that 99 out of 100 producers are family farmers, and it really hides the reality of the relationship where, again, the integrator is calling all the shots. And that also means that the farmer or the contract producer, sometimes they're called, doesn't have the option to do better by their community. They don't have the option to structure their business in a way that would have fewer impacts, be it quality of life to their neighbors or the environment, because it's not really their choice. They're under this contract, which is going to tell them exactly how they're going to run their operation. And if not, they get cut. And there might not be another integrator in their area to pick up the slack. So they may be sitting there with a $5 million debt on a building they can't use in any other way, but service this integrator who's forcing them to be a bad neighbor. And so it's also important to identify where the blame should lay. And the blame needs to lay with these massive corporations that have manipulated the system to their benefit, not on the individuals who frankly get stuck as contract producers under these really exploitive relationships. So supporting family farmers is critical. Knowing what you're talking about is equally critical when you're wanting to support that side of the system.
Chris, Tyler raises a good point about who the family farmer really is. And I think we need to pay close attention to that because in a number of cases, we're seeing where these are merely investments for folks in many areas. So it's not necessarily a family farm or a family owning this. This is someone who doesn't even eat meat, for example, who's decided this is a good thing for me to invest in and raise and make money off of. So I think we have to be really careful when we talk about who the farmer or who the family farm is. And one of the things I think we all have got to do better at is working with the small farmers who are raising the food sustainably, so that we are getting meat that we know is healthy, that hasn't necessarily been injected with hormones and steroids and antibiotics to keep them well and grow them fast, and then come out at the other end. And we as humans are getting in, are ingesting some of the same things that went into those animals over time. Sustainability should be the key in all of our minds as we are purchasing. Yes, it may be a few pennies more per pound, but in the long term, I would say it's worth it, or at least knowing where it comes from, and supporting the farmers who are trying to do the best job possible.
If I could just add one more note to that, and that's this idea to this myth that this industrialized approach to growing livestock is necessary for our food system. And at least in North Carolina, 40 years ago, there were certainly way more family farmers, independent farmers that were producing almost as many hogs. They were producing them on the ground, and they were not practicing, this approach to waste management that's harmful to the environment and health. So I think that is an important piece to add to the story, that we can feed just as many people in a way that's more sustainable.
Well, I appreciate these answers too, because you're really addressing what y'all have mentioned as PR coming from these multi-million-dollar corporations, and where they are using misinformation to obscure the realities and harms of the industries. I guess with that PR and misinformation campaign, how are environmental justice communities portrayed in that messaging?
In North Carolina, there have been some very effective campaigns to suggest that the communities who live around these operations, who have raised issues about concerns, are against family farms or family farmers. And that is certainly not the case, but the campaigns, the communities can't compete with the kind of access to power, to money, to do the advertisements and the campaigns that these industries can do. And so that creates another problem altogether, and this isn't a question you've asked, but even in trying to do this work, suggesting to community members who are so tied to the industry and agricultural communities like these, that to say anything against the industry or to get involved with any advocacy against the industry would mean that there would be job losses, that companies would shut down, those kinds of things. So the PR machine is working overtime, and we've just got to continue to work and spread the word that there is a better way to do this, to be more protective of the communities where this is happening. Certainly communities like the ones I come from aren't trying to put anyone out of business. But we want to relay the message that there are safer and better ways to do this work, so that the community members who have to live around these facilities are at least protected in the best way possible.
Yeah, our experience has been kind of similar to what Sherry said, is that it's portraying anybody calling into question the industry as job killers and hurting their families and hurting their communities. And also there's a really effective approach among a lot of the larger growers, and definitely the dairies, to give away kind of turkeys and Thanksgiving and bikes, etc. And they're like, you liked us fine at Thanksgiving, so kind of you want everything, you know, you want you want clean air and you want the bikes, is kind of often leveled at folks. And then just, you spoke to this a little bit, Sherry, too, is just straight intimidation. So we work with somebody right now who feels like she sees a white van behind her all the time. And then when we raise it, I think the powers that be say, well, she's crazy, and nothing like that is happening. So.
All right. So this one's for Sherry specifically, and Courtney, as in North Carolina. I think you can address some of this too. But since North Carolina is considered the birthplace of the environmental justice movement, but it also has some of the biggest disparities for public health and environmental quality. What are some of the major issues related to those disparities and environmental injustice in North Carolina?
Courtney, do you want to take that one first?
Sure. Well, I think I'll bring us maybe back to this idea of cumulative impacts in many parts of the state. And there's a link connecting so many of the things that we talked about. So, the issues of zoning and lack of zoning in certain parts of the state, the composition of planning boards and county or city council in certain more rural parts of the state, certainly contributes to unwanted land uses being disproportionately located, and certain decisions for unwanted sites to be located in communities of color and lower income communities. So I think that's one thing that contributes. I think another thing to note is, we spent a lot of time talking about the negative or unwanted land uses, and also need to give some attention to salutogenic and healthful land uses as well, and access to healthcare and green spaces and that sort of thing. And I think similar mechanisms are at play for communities of color not receiving the appropriate amount of investment in land uses and infrastructure that would promote and enhance their health. There's certainly issues with extraterritorial jurisdiction in North Carolina, where areas that are outside of the municipality are not able to get access to drinking water and sewerage infrastructure. And I think the challenge of not considering what a community is already burdened with, or not considering the access to health infrastructure or other resources when new decisions are being made around siting a facility in a community. I think that matters, and so I certainly think that has contributed to EJ disproportionate impacts on communities of color in North Carolina. I don't know if you want to enumerate some of the specific sources of exposure in North Carolina, Sherry, or at least in Sampson County.
Well, I wanted to sort of piggyback on some of the things you were saying, and I can talk about that a little bit as well. But I think one of the problems that is contributing to the problems we're seeing with disparities is less than robust tools for communities to be able to have access to actually know what's going on in various communities, deeper than just census tract data. lack of sharing of already existing health data and refusal to collect data in areas like where we come from. Rural areas are least likely to be monitored for anything. So the story can be, the argument can be made that there are no real harms, but there aren't harms if you don't bother to collect the data in those areas to know what the harms might be. So, that is a huge issue. There's also sort of the complicity between the permitting process and the business incentivizing process. The incentives to draw businesses into communities that may be lower income, already with existing entities that are not helpful to the community, are not aware of a business that may further inundate that community until the decision is made. Those decisions are done behind closed doors with no transparency whatsoever. And then the entity goes to the state environmental agency and says, I need a permit. And then the permit is granted because cumulative impacts, as we've said many times, is an issue. And they aren't considered in the permitting process. So you are incentivizing a business to come into a place that's already inundated and not a process to protect the community through the permitting process. So therein lies another reason why there are many disparities in these communities. And that lack of transparency creates a level of distrust within the system for local community members. So it makes it difficult to talk with local community members, to get them engaged to advocate on behalf of themselves or their families. And then the process for trying to do that can be very convoluted for a lot of folks. So I think that there are a lot of reasons why we're still seeing a lot of disparities. And until we have the kind of robust data that we need to have for many of these communities, we will still not be able to make the kind of case we need to make that will ultimately lead to some type of change.
Thanks for that. I think you both hit on a lot of points there, but I just want to highlight that what you said, Sherry, in terms of people being asked to engage in the process on a decision that's already been made. So going to a public hearing on a permit, that really whether or not people attend and voice very clear, a clear objection to the process and very well laid out why it will impact them and their community and also the environment, and things still get permitted and things continue. So that is something that people lose faith in the overall system there. And I want to go on to a question from somebody in the audience. Marcus asked, what are the state and federal policies that support and are barriers to land use for this particular situation? So we've talked about like the Clean Air Act and some of the holes in there that kind of allow some of these things. Are there policies that help?
Tyler, maybe I should let you address that. I can't think of a lot of federal policies that would help at this point because for me, it appears that the ag industry is not just powerful within states, but it's also powerful at the federal level as well. And as a result, we're seeing very few policies that are coming out at the federal level that are supportive. And I'll give you just one example. We talked about digesters. There is a program in the USDA under rural development called the Rural Energy for America program that is supposed to be promoting more energy efficiency, wind and solar. In this last round, what USDA has decided is to give an extra 15 points to industries that come in and say that they're going to put a digester in an impacted community. There is no requirement for the best technology to be used. There's really no major criteria that's set up other than just tell us you're going to put a digester in an impacted community, and we're great with that. We'll give you 15 extra points. And until the federal government or federal decision makers understand that there needs to be some criteria put on programs like that so that it is protective of these communities that the administration says they want to protect, nothing will ever change. So that's just one example at the federal level. At the state level, the policies are generally written to be very favorable to the agriculture industry. And that again has to do with the power of the legislator versus the power of the communities that they represent. And in terms of barriers, land use is an issue, because if you think about it, if you are someone who has gone through a planning program, you're usually learning planning and land use in urban or suburban areas. You aren't learning land use or planning in rural areas. And until, again, more emphasis is made around all of that as academic institutions try to sensitize students to the issues of rural America, we're still going to have these barriers, because again, data is what we need and what we don't have. Tyler, I'll turn it over to you.
Sure, thanks, Sherry. A really great question, Marcus. And so at the state level, it's really important that you look at your state and to figure out exactly what the situation is, because a lot of states have what are sometimes called right to farm laws, which really strip local decision-making away from local decision makers. And so zoning, where an industry is going to be sited, where it will be allowed to be sited, is historically and traditionally a local decision to be made locally. For this industry, that's largely been flipped on its head, where state government gets to what's called, they pass laws which preempt local efforts to make these kinds of decisions, to say we don't want this many CAFOs in our county or whatever it is. That authority has been taken away and the state gets to call the shots. So that's one barrier, that it's good to inform yourself on what is the situation in my state. I live in Idaho, and we actually, the decisions are made at the county level. And that's, in my opinion, more productive than in certain states where everything is now given to the state legislators. So your state situation could be different. It's kind of a hodgepodge around the country, but these right to farm laws are often a very significant barrier, both to siting or to protecting yourself after the fact. You know, they might make it such that you can't bring a nuisance claim against a bad factory farm that's next to you. But then on the federal level, I mean, Sherry's absolutely correct. There's very little federal oversight of this industry, and especially when it comes to land use. One thing that Food and Water Watch has done is look to the Safe Drinking Water Act. So I mentioned this problem of nitrate contamination and phosphorus contamination, this drinking water crisis that tends to follow the factory farm industry around. The Safe Drinking Water Act gives the US EPA, Environmental Protection Agency, a huge amount of authority to deal with a contamination crisis like that. And so we have Safe Drinking Water Act petitions to EPA for Eastern Oregon, for Yakima Valley in Washington State, for Minnesota, and there's one pending from years ago in Wisconsin. And so because federal laws, because this industry has been given such like a role of exceptionalism under the regulatory framework, right? Like all the protections that we expect for air quality and water quality just don't apply the way they should to this industry, or aren't being applied the way they should. It can be really challenging to find those federal controls and how they're actually protecting communities. But the Safe Drinking Water Act is one of those tools. And then the Clean Water Act, Sherry's point about an absence of data is such an important one. And this industry has created that absence of data and then relies on that absence of data. Mm-hmm. So they'll say, oh, well, show me the data that we're polluting the environment. Well, you've been deliberately not collecting data for decades. And so we lack that data. And so that's, there's a growing coalition of groups, and Food and Water Watch has been pushing this really hard of trying to get the permits when a factory farm is operating under a permit, to ensure that there's monitoring that the facility itself has to conduct, so that community groups aren't on the hook to pay for their own monitoring to hold the industry accountable. It really should be on the industry itself to be monitoring its own pollution and then publicly reporting that data so that communities can protect themselves without, breaking the bank to go do what EPA and local regulators should have been requiring the industry to do, and that is show what its pollution costs really are.
And thank you. We've got just under 10 minutes left, and so I want to give each of the panelists a couple minutes to just tell us. We've been talking about industrial animal farming as something that we don't want. Really hazardous. It's something that puts money over people every time, puts money over the land. And what are relationships that we want to have with the land? What are examples of things that we want to see? What does honest repair look like? What is not a false solution, but true honest repair in these landscapes look like where you are?
That's a really good question. I think we're really used to kind of fighting bad and less used to elevating good. There is an opportunity in California called the Multi-Benefit Land Repurposing Program that we see some opportunity in, where we're looking at transitioning land in areas without adequate water. And so we've been advocating a lot for putting that land back into the community's hands, and especially communities that have been dispossessed of their land, to really democratize decision making around at least that land, and create community-based assets in what has been land and practices that have been polluting those communities.
Wonderful. Thank you, Phoebe.
I think for communities, for rural communities, there aren't clear solutions at this point. I think a lot of rural communities, particularly in North Carolina, are still trying to figure it out because they've been bombarded for so long with all of these concentrated animal feeding operations. There are a lot of efforts to educate local community members to help them to understand that they can help make changes by engaging with trusted local leaders in their areas to try and help to make change at the local level. The state level change is a little bit more difficult, but also partnering with local affiliate organizations that are both local, but also statewide organizations that sort of are on the same sheet of music as they are, to work collaboratively to try and help make change. But I think one of the biggest things that we're seeing is just the opportunity for folks to speak up and be able to speak out, because they have not been able to do that. And then to push those officials that are friendly to these issues to do a little bit more, because we recognize that this is an issue that touches all of us. But the story of the impact on rural communities has not been told broadly enough. And one of the goals that we should all have is to tell this story everywhere we go, so that folks better understand that because you say you're from rural America, that it's not a wide open, green, wonderful space with fresh air and all of the things that I think folks tend to equate with rural areas, but starting to understand that those hidden places are where these industries are starting to and have been coming in for years and years and years and polluting as much, and I would say even more so than in more urban areas that we hear about all the time.
I'd really like to see a Christmas rom-com that focuses on that very topic, Sherry, of not the idyllic piece, that there's other things going on. Thank you for that. Tyler, you want to go on next? Courtney, I'm going to leave you for last.
Okay.
Sure. I mean, what does honest repair look like? A few things. One, not adding biogas production on top of a fundamentally extractive and harmful system. So that is not honest repair. That is moving in the opposite direction for sure. But I think it's really important to flag that we didn't end up with this system and these problems by accident. It's not because these are the most efficient systems for raising animals. It's because this was the way for corporations to make the most profit. And we had policymakers who were in the pocket of those corporate interests that greased the wheels of a transition away from what people think of as farming, the red barn, the father and daughter out on a field petting their animals. That was replaced by the system, this highly industrialized, concentrated, profit-seeking system that we have today. And that was because bad policies were put into place at the state and the federal and the local levels. The factory farm system won't survive without an enormous amount of public support. That's straight money that we give them out of our tax dollars to help them build their factory farms and run their factory farms. That's also all of these pollution costs that our regulators have let them externalize or put on to local communities and not have to bear as a business themselves, right? When I'm a power plant and I'm required to reduce my emissions, I invest in something and then my ratepayers or someone pays that. This industry doesn't do that. They just throw their pollution onto the environment with no cost and then get to charge less for their products. But there is a cost associated with their practices. And so just recognizing that this system isn't inevitable. It's the result of the get big or get out ag mentality that that short-sighted policymakers have adopted for the past couple decades, and we will transition away from it. Right? It is a fundamentally unsustainable system on multiple levels, and so looking to things like Senator Booker has the Farm System Reform Act. There is growing awareness that we have to repair our food system and repair how we raise animals in this country. And so things like the Farm System Reform Act, state level efforts are really important to support and educate yourself on. Because again, the solutions are out there. This system is a temporary blight on our story. So with that, I'll pass it to Courtney.
Thank you, Tyler.
I want to, just maybe offer some thoughts around, we've spent a lot of time focusing on like the political pieces that influence these decisions. And I really do feel like there's also a cultural shift and a focus on changing the culture of our communities as well, and of our policymakers, I guess. That is really important. I think for sure we got to organize it. We have to organize so that if the policymakers that we've elected aren't making the decisions that we'd like them to see, that we are growing our own. And I think a part of that sort of organizing happens when folks are coming together and both fighting the bad, but also imagining what they want to see in their communities, what sort of safe and sustainable jobs they want to see in their communities, beyond the sorts of jobs that these industries are telling us are good for rural America. And so I would love to support more cultural organizing. We're doing some of that in Durham, North Carolina, not a rural community, but I think there are lots of lessons that I've learned from we have a land collective here in Durham, Earthseed Land Collective, that is bringing folks together to grow food and to practice cultural arts and to envision what community building can look like. And so, I think bringing folks together to dream and envision what their futures look like is important. And that has to involve young people. Their voices in this really, really do matter.
Well, I want to thank all of you as panelists, Courtney, Sherry, Tyler, and Phoebe, who we lost for a moment. But thank you all so much for sharing your expertise and wisdom on this topic. I want to do a shameless really plug that I asked that last question of false solutions and honest repair, because we have an environmental justice summit in North Carolina on October 20th and 21st on that very topic, featuring some of these very speakers. So you can learn more and talk more about this conversation as well. And I just want to thank everybody for being here and to really be thinking about rural communities in particular in environmental justice. So thank you all, and enjoy the rest of your day in conference and the plenary that starts at 12:30 for the lunchtime plenary. So thank you all, and I'll see you around.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Okay.